Spain and the American Revolution, ally or opportunist, and at the end of this presentation, I'm going to take a hand vote to see which one you think they are. American Revolution starts. All the European countries are watching this, and it's affecting trade because the British system was a mercantile system, which basically they got goods from the colonies, shipped them to England, produced finished goods, and shipped them back to their colonies and sold them. What had been happening for as long as the colonies were there is the colonies were trading with everybody else. They weren't supposed to. They were trading with Spain. Spain was trading with them. They were trading with the Dutch. They were trading with the Russians. They were trading with the Prussians. There was some trade with the Ottoman Empire. So there was a lot more to it. But anyway, let's get into this. We're not going to jump down that rabbit hole. Let's get to the Spanish involvement. And, oh, come on, my laser's not cooperating here. See that little thing right there? The 3 fleur-de-lis in the blue, that's going to come to be very important because that is a symbol of the Bourbon family, which were the kings of France at the time and the kings of Spain. So that does come into it a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. A brief history of Spain. And this is going to be very brief. Believe me, if I got into the Moorish period, we'd be here for a week. If you look at the map, this is 756 AD, post the Roman Empire. The Spanish ended up getting invaded by, everybody always says the Moors, but if you look on the chart, the dark green areas were Arabs, the light green areas were Berbers, and then on top you've got the, oh God, you have the part of Spain that did stay free, and those people are still trying to break away from Spain to this day. They don't want to be part of, what's Basque. Sorry, brain fart. And by 940, they're starting to push the Islamists out, and you see the separate kingdoms, which some of them are still trying to break away from Spain today. By 940, this thing did. By 1212, the Islamists are pushed into the south. They still hold Madrid, some of the major ports. They hold Gibraltar. And by 1492, we all know what happened in 1492, the ocean blue. They're pretty much pushed out. The Spanish have Gibraltar, and there's actually a Spanish enclave in North Africa that is actually Spain. I don't remember the name of the town, Ceuta. It's actually Spain, and it's a thorn in the Arabs' side, but the Spanish aren't giving it up. So, let's move on to, I keep pushing the wrong button, Spanish leadership. During the American Revolution, it was Charles III who lived from 1716 to 1788. He was king from August 1759 to December 14, 1788. He originally was a king of Naples and Sicily, which was actually controlled by the Spanish royal family, which is in Italy, okay? This is going to come to, and then once the sitting king died, he became the king of Spain. One of the things he realized very quickly was that the Spanish gold and silver trade out of South America was dying. They weren't pulling as much out. Yes, they were still pulling cash crops and minerals and everything else, but it wasn't, the old Spanish treasure fleets were not what they had been at one time. So his goal was to modernize the Spanish economy. So he was watching France, he was watching England, he was watching Holland, and they're all modernizing. Spain isn't. So he was the king of Spain during the American Revolution. Now, 1754, 1763, French and Indian War in North America, the 7 Years' War in Europe. Spain is heavily involved. Unfortunately, Spain is on the losing side. They fought with the French. Again, the Bourbon connection is the same royal house. The Treaty of Paris is signed February 10, 1763. France loses territory east of the Mississippi. Spain loses Florida, which becomes British East and West Florida. And this is going to be important because at that time, Florida stretched all the way from the Atlantic coast all the way the way to the Mississippi. Now, what the British didn't know is British wanted what became the Louisiana Purchase is right before that, the Treaty of, in French it'd be Fontainebleau, but I'm not sure what the Spanish pronunciation, was signed on November 3rd, 1762, gave Louisiana to Spain. The French just didn't bother to mention that to the British when they were negotiating the Treaty of Paris. So, the Louisiana Territory, basically the Louisiana Purchase, went from French hands to Spanish hands. Same old family, should be a smooth transition, right? And after the residents of Louisiana found out, they rebelled in 1768 and tried to throw the Spanish governor out. Spain had to send a guy named O'Reilly, very Spanish name, to put the rebellion down. Now, when you talk about rebellion, the whole population of Louisiana at that time was negligible. I mean, New Orleans, I think, was 4,000 people total. But still, the Spanish wanted control. The problem the Spanish had is New Orleans is actually on the eastern side of the Mississippi, so technically that should have been British territory. So they did come to an agreement with the English that they could use New Orleans for commerce. That didn't work out so well, and the British really didn't get access, but that's where we leave it. 1769, Spain takes formal possession of Louisiana, which is a, if you know anything about Louisiana Purchase, is a huge swath of land. And the Spanish literally didn't have the manpower. The Spanish governors are looking at this knowing there's no way we can control all this territory, and half of it, we don't know what's in it, because they haven't been up in the Dakotas and everything else. So they're kind of at a loss. Spain has a few problems. One, it's a large territory full of people who don't want them there. So I guarantee you the natives didn't want the French there, they didn't want the Spanish there, and they sure didn't want the British there. The French residents and natives don't want them there in New Orleans. So the Spanish governors are kind of at a crossroads. The territory is hard to defend because of the small population. And literally, if the Spanish governor is sitting in his house, he can look across the river and see the British garrison. That's how close everything is. So they're kind of in a pickle. They go through a series of governors who some are somewhat effective, some are completely not effective. But that's English troops on their doorsteps. And the British, if you know anything about the French and Indian War, were very good at stirring up the local tribes. So they're trying to stir up the local tribes in Louisiana, in Mississippi, to cause the Spanish problem. I'm sure the Spanish are doing the same thing in reverse, but anyway. Because they lost St. Augustine, that takes away a safe harbor for their treasure fleet. Because that was one of the biggest reasons St. Augustine was there. If the ship got in trouble, they had a port to go to. The British used Bermuda, the Spanish used St. Augustine. Losing St. Augustine was a major blow to the Spanish. They appointed a series of governors, various levels of success, and there's an agreement for navigation of the Mississippi. And actually, after the American Revolution, there was also an agreement between the United States and Spain, which wasn't that effective, but on paper at least there was an agreement. Okay, here comes a twist. 1373, you have the Anglo-Portuguese, and you go on how Portugal does play, agreement. This is the longest existing diplomatic treaty in history. It is still in effect to this day. Portugal and England are allies. In fact, 2 years ago they had a major celebration for the 750th anniversary or something else. So that it was a big deal. So the Spanish are always facing Portugal. You also have to remember South America, Brazil is Portuguese, not Spanish. England and Portugal, all this diplomatic treaty is still in force. And as I said, that meant that what Spain could do was limited because of the threat of Portugal. If they go to war with England, it's Portugal that step in. And that's the basic wording of the main part of the treaty that is still in effect today. The English-Portuguese Treaty of Friendship is what it's called now. They've changed the name of it. But that's the big, I'll let you read it. I'm not going to read it word for word. And during the Napoleonic Wars, this treaty came into effect, and the British went to the Portuguese's assistance. Of course, I think it's because they hated Napoleon more. 1776, 1777, there is a Spanish-Portuguese war in South America, in southern Brazil, right on the River Plate. The Portuguese get trounced, and there is a treaty. The Portuguese can get most of their land back, but now Spain has Portugal off the chessboard. The Portuguese are not going to get involved because they know it's a situation they can't win. And the Spanish had gotten into this war because they knew the English could not come to the Portuguese's aid because they were busy with the American colonies. So, the war causes Portugal to remain neutral. Spain now has a free hand. And the other problem the Spanish had is it was the world versus the Spanish. Those treasure fleets, those pirates in the Caribbean were going after Spanish gold. That was their main source of income, because those ships were slow and fat and had lots and lots of gold and silver on board. Also, lots of tobacco, and if you ever want to read a really interesting book on it, read Churchill's Cigar, which is the history of Churchill through cigars, and they actually go through the first cigar that came out of South America. Spain enters into the war. Okay. First, they form a company, Rodrigo, and I'm going to butcher this, Portales and Company, founded in early 1776. The French had done the same thing. They had formed a company. Basically, it's a shell company so they can sell or give supplies to the Americans under the cover of, we don't know what this company's doing. And the French were shipping most of the product into Charleston. The Spanish were shipping most of it to St. Eustatius, which to this day is a Dutch colony. St. Eustatius, I think, is like 3 square miles. It's a little bitty place, a very rich colony at the time. It was until the British invaded during the American Revolution and laid waste to it. It's never recovered. To this day, it's not much there. But that's what they used. This is the first Secretary of Spain, basically their foreign secretary, and he said the fate of the colonies interests us very much, and we should do for them everything that its circumstances permit. So the Spanish were already looking at the American Revolution and going, hey, we can help the colonists and cause the British problems. How's that a bad thing? Hey, none of these countries liked each other at that time. In 1776. The Spanish gave 1 million French livres, which is basically French pounds, to the American cause. Very surreptitiously, didn't make a big deal out of it, ran it through this company that I showed you earlier. No, we didn't give the money, it just showed up. That funded 216 cannons, 27 mortars, 238 gun carriages, 51,000 rounds of artillery rounds, 300,000 pounds of gunpowder, 30,000 muskets, 4,000 tents, and 30,000 uniforms. So the Continental Army, to a great extent, was carrying Spanish equipment. If you look at Clark's expedition into Indiana and Illinois, a lot of their uniforms were Spanish uniforms, not French uniforms or American uniforms. So this, you think 4,000 tents for an army that has nothing? That's a lot of value. Okay, so Ben Franklin wrote a letter to the Countess, to the Spanish envoy in Paris, and thanked him for the 200,000. So there was another 200,000 that came in, and that is the guy he was talking with, whose last name is Casanova. And as far as I can see, he might have been related to the famous person in literature, Casanova. Okay, Spain sent supplies through the house, and I'm not going to try to massacre that, using Havana and Bilbao. Havana, why Havana? Havana had and this was passed on to me by some of the guys from the St. Augustine years, Havana was dependent, Cuba was dependent on American grain and food because they grew a lot of cash crops. They grew tobacco, they grew a lot of cash crops for Spain. The problem is those slaves had to be fed. Where did they get their grain? Pennsylvania, New York. They weren't supposed to be trading with the Spanish. They had been trading with the Spanish since before the 7 Years' War. They did not care. Those Pennsylvania farmers that have gold in their pockets, they'll sell it to whoever. So the Spanish needed that grain, and British being there was causing a problem. It was causing a massive problem for the Spanish. In 1776, General Charles Lee sent 2 officers to request supplies in New Orleans, and got some success, not much. The governor authorized covert shipments, but still, you look at where New Orleans is, and you look where the 13 colonies are, you're not shipping it from there land-wise. You're having to go all the way around. Problem is, Florida is a British possession, not a Spanish possession. This is kind of the gray man of this, a guy named Oliver Pollock. I don't know if you know much more about him. I didn't find him. He was an American financier who was tied in with the Spanish and did some work in New Orleans, and he was getting supplies and funds sent through them. He was Irish born and was representing the American cause. Now, in 1777, a new governor gets appointed in Spanish Louisiana, named Bernardo Vincent Galvez y Madrid, first Count of Galvez, appointed in January 1777. Pretty much kept a lot of the policies the same, but the problem he had is, again, the same problem all the other governors had. They're looking out of their house and they're seeing the British garrison on the other side of the river. Not good. He's looking at his defenses. He doesn't have enough troops. He knows the British put a major push. He's going to have a hard time defending. So, 1777, Franklin reports to the Congressional Committee, secret correspondence, the Americans have been granted most favored nation status by the Spanish. You know, we talk about that all the time in modern politics, most nation favored states. Well, that means you get to trade with us. So the Spanish are starting to move toward the Americans in a much more open way. They grant the Americans access to Havana, because the Americans can't use the Dutch forts, because the British either blockade them or burn them to the ground. 1781, Portugal enters the League of Armed Neutrality to protest British seizure of neutral ships. And this actually comes into play because the British were doing the same thing they did in what led to the War of 1812. They were stopping neutral ships at sea, seizing cargo. Oh, it's contraband. You're going to ship it to the Americans. They seize it off the ships and take a few seconds. This guy's British. Yeah, he is. The fact he's Russian has nothing to do with it. They need sailors. So a bunch of the countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Prussia, Russia, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire all joined this League of Armed Neutrality. And they basically told the British, you keep messing with us, we're going to bite back. The thing this does with Portugal entering, it takes Portugal completely off the board as far as fighting this, doing anything to the Spanish if they get involved in the war. So this completely freed the Spanish hands. And those are the countries that were involved in the first League of Armed Neutrality. There was another League of Armed Neutrality during the Napoleonic War. So this is something that the pattern followed later. Okay. This gentleman here was the ambassador to the French court. He came into contact with a guy named Arthur Lee, yes, of the Lee family. And he tried to pursue Spain to ally itself with America. So they weren't going to Spain and talking to him, they were talking to the Spanish in the French court. And this is the response he got. You've considered your situation and not ours. The Spanish are saying, look, we understand you need our help, but you're not looking at our point of view. The moment has not yet come. The war with Portugal, France being unprepared, our cargo ships in South America have not arrived, makes it improper for us to declare it. The Spanish want to get their ships back in, and they wanted to make sure Portugal was off the board. Because yes, they were going to beat Portugal if they got into a war, but if you're in two wars at the same time, it changes things. June 1779, Spain prepares for war. And here is the treaty in April 12, 1779. They sign, it gets them into the war. The treaty is not with us. Remember, France signed a treaty with the United States. The Spanish signed a treaty with the French. They were French allies, not American allies. Big distinction. One of the terms with the French, this would give France exclusive, when the war was over and they won, the French would get exclusive fishing rights off Newfoundland, and this was never revealed to the Americans. And this was a big deal because France depended on those fishing grounds off Canada to feed their people. There is still French territory in Canada. St. Kitts and Nevis to this day is still French. It is not part of Canada. You walk in there, you're in France. This is what the Spanish basically wanted. They wanted the recovery of Gibraltar. Didn't work out too well for them. British flag still flies over Gibraltar. They wanted Minorca back, and they wanted Florida back. And there's another one, they also wanted, they were part of the treaty of this ending the French and Indian War. The British had gotten rights to chop wood on some island, and apparently this really upset the Spanish, and they wanted that back. And the Spanish would only attack British possessions. Since they were at war with England, I don't think that was really a big deal, but apparently they made a point of the treaty. There was a concern in Spain that the American Revolution would fuel the Spanish colonies with ideas. Independence, freedom, etc. They were right. 19th century, a gentleman named Simon Bolivar proved them right. When most of the Spanish possessions in the Americas, Mexico, all got their independence over, what, a 20-year period? Something like that. Got their independence. So yes, they were right. And the French were also concerned. Of course, the French comeuppance came a little earlier in the French Revolution. France agreed not to end the war until Gibraltar was retaken. That was a big lie, as we will see later. And part of this, you have to realize, most of this, the Americans were not privy to most of this. They did not know any of this was going on. Spain suggested America should give up Georgia. Now, the people in Georgia probably would not have been happy with that, but the Spanish wanted Georgia because that would have given them a buffer between either English America or an independent America. France suggested that the border between, and this is where this part of Tennessee would have been heavily affected. France actually suggested to Spain that the border post-war should be the proclamation line of 1763, that would put Watauga in Spanish territory. So this is very important to them. Now, in the end, you'll see other things happen. The British kind of pulled a fast one on the Spanish and the French. Spain and France's goals was to make America dependent on them for trade. Britain made sure that didn't happen by trading with the Americans post-war. And if you look at the map, well, we're not at the map yet. Let's get to the map. You look at the map of how America got its possessions. It was a very step-by-step thing. But this was, the majority of Spanish control was right in here. So trading with the American colonies would have been kind of tough, when the British had direct access through here. But the Spanish and the French wanted that American trade, and they figured post-war, since they'd helped the Americans, they would get it. The British were smart enough to keep that trade. As soon as the war was over, the British started trading with the Americans. They didn't want the Americans falling into the Spanish-French war, and it would have cost them a lot of money if they had. So anyway, some of the battles involved, actually the last battle in the lower 48 involving the Spanish was in Arkansas. Arkansas, of all places. Arkansas Post. It's West Helena, Arkansas.
Helena is further north.
Well, that's, the British attacked Fort Carlos III Arkansas post. It is commanded by James Colbert, commander of the 16th Foot with irregulars and Chickasaw. The Louisiana Fixed Regiment and Quapaw pulled them back, and they failed. They didn't take the fort. There was also a Spanish garrison in what is modern-day Vicksburg. There was a garrison in what is modern-day Memphis, and I'm sure there were a lot of others. I live in a small county in Arkansas. They found a Spanish trading post about 20 years ago. Nobody knew it was even there. Now the next one is the Battle of Fort St. Carlos for St. Louis, May 26, 1783. Notice a lot of these battles are very late in the war or after peace was done. Spanish commanded by Captain Fernando de Libia, militia and irregulars attacked. The British were attacked by the British. They attacked Cahokia in Illinois. Native Ho-Chunks, Kickapoo, Ottawas, Muscatine, Menominee, Potawatomi, Sioux, and Sac and Fox all helped attack. So yes, there were small British incursions in the Spanish territory. They tried to make incursions, and none of these battles were large amounts of people. They really weren't. But they wanted those trading posts. They wanted control of the Mississippi River. That was the golden key, the Mississippi. Now, here we get into the campaign that eventually leads to the Siege of Pensacola. The first battle, Galvez realizes he cannot defend New Orleans with the troops he's got. The British put a major push on. Much like the British did the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, they could have shipped troops in there and taken New Orleans like that. There's nothing he could have done about it. So he decides to go on the offense. September 7th, 1779, he is going to attack Fort Butte, which was just on the other side of the river from New Orleans. It's modern-day East Baton Rouge Parish. Galvez had the intelligence that the British are planning on attacking New Orleans. Is about 115 miles east of New Orleans. Now, think of going 115 miles through the swamps of southern Louisiana and Mississippi with no roads. That is an achievement in itself. The one thing that I've learned with Galvez is this man was one heck of a logistician. He knew how to get things done. And the British were sending more troops there because Clark's expedition had just hit Vincennes in the Illinois and the Indiana territory. So the British were very afraid of what was going to happen on the southern end. They hadn't put enough troops in Indiana and the Ohio country and everything else, so the British were on alert. The fort was commanded by Colonel Alexander Dixon, 400 British regulars from the 16th and 60th Foot. 60th Foot was the Royal Americans. That whole regiment was basically made of Loyalist Americans and had been founded during the French and Indian War. It was actually called the Royal Americans. And they stayed on the British establishment until the 1980s, the Rifle Regiment. It was the only regiment in the British Army that an American citizen could legally join. Upon hearing of the Spanish were coming, Dixon did the brave thing. He left. The only thing he left was 20 Waldeckers, German troops, from a country about the size of this county. He left those poor guys at this fort and said, "Here, defend it." Well, Galvez left New Orleans on the 20th of August, left in 520 regulars, most of them raw troops, 60 militiamen, 80 free men of color, and also 10 men led by this Oliver Pollock that we talked about earlier. They also picked up Acadians, native forces, and by the time he got there, it was 1,400 men versus 20. Spanish lost several hundred men through the conditions of the swamps. And basically, anybody's been to southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, you know how bad it can get down. And it's, a hot time of year. September 6th, Galvez finally tells these men that Spain is at war with the British. Up to then, these guys really didn't know why they were going. On September 7th, they attacked. 1 German soldier was killed, 6 Germans escaped, went to Baton Rouge to warn the British. The Spanish were on the way, and Galvez stayed there for 6 days before moving on to Baton Rouge. And I'm sure the 6 days was trying to get his troops to recover from that wonderful trip they just had through the swamps. And then you look at his losses, he was much reduced. September 21st, 1779, Galvin digs trenches and moves up on artillery on the Baton Rouge. He opened fire September 21st and September 22nd, where their honor satisfied, the British surrender, and they also surrendered Natchez, which was under British control. Galvez left the garrison there and went back to New Orleans. His ultimate goal was Pensacola, but there was no way he was going to move from Baton Rouge to Pensacola on land. He'd seen the losses 115 miles it cost him. Several hundred more miles would cost him a lot more troops. Also, Spanish privateers captured British ships on Lake Pontchartrain, which I'm not real sure what the British were doing on Lake Pontchartrain. That wasn't the wisest move. And they captured 53 more Waldeckers. So most of the Waldecker regiment ended up in Spanish prisons. Effectively cleared the British from Louisiana and cleared away the invasion of Florida. This took the pressure off Galvez. Now he did not have that British threat on the other side of the Mississippi. So what happened in Florida? Well, St. Augustine, most of you, and I know somebody before the lecture was talking about St. Augustine. St. Augustine, there was some movement in eastern Florida, East Florida. There were some people that wanted to side with colonies and become the 14th colony. Problem was, very small population, and also you had a lot of loyalists. St. Augustine ended up being basically a supply base for loyalist units that operated, or used loyal to the British that operated in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Some of the units that were formed, East Florida Rangers, the South Carolina Royalists, and King's Rangers. And King's Rangers, if you ever read the story of them, it's very interesting. The man who actually founded the unit wanted to stay neutral, and some loyal Americans tarred and feathered him and burned his feet, and he decided that the British side was better. Siege of Pensacola. The Spanish were going to move out in April. Hurricane hits, they have to move out later. The fleet sailed in October 1780, scattered by hurricanes again. This is the British commander of Pensacola, a General John Campbell. He was a colonel at the time, and that is a picture of him very much in later life. He had, again, part of the 16th Regiment of Foot, a battalion of 60th Royal Americans, 7th Company of Royal Artillery, more Waldeckers. Now these poor guys from Germany who lived in a very cold country got sent to Florida. The Maryland Loyalists, the Pennsylvania Loyalists, local militias, 15 to 2,000 natives, and that's the garrison of Pensacola. And that's the basic layout of Pensacola, and that's the streets and everything. That's a very modern map of Pensacola, but that kind of shows you relative to modern day. The Spanish and the French sent troops, because the French wanted Pensacola gone too, because it was a threat to some of their possessions of the Caribbean. So that's what happened. He ended up sailing to Pensacola and not walking to Pensacola, which is probably a good idea. Marocan Regiment, 1,300 men, Hibernia Regiment, which is an Irish regiment. There were a lot of Irish because they were Catholic and settled in Spain after the troubles with the British. Militia of free men and biracial men. And this is a weird one. This regiment right here, the Flanders Regiment. You have to remember that Holland and Belgium had both been part of Spanish Netherlands. So they still had troops from those countries. And those were French-speaking Belgians. There was a regiment there. So there were Belgians at this siege, all 193 of them. Spanish Royal Artillery, your regiment, 135 men. And you have to be careful with these numbers because it depends which source you go to, what the numbers are. I've seen this regiment as high as 200, I've seen it as low as 10, so I don't know which one's right. Dragoons of America and Louisiana, two separate regiments, 128. 1,504 naval infantry, so those poor sailors got pulled off their ship and said, here's a musket, have fun. Two French regiments, Agenouin and Guthrie. Again, guys from Europe who are now dropped in the middle of a swamp. May 8th, they attacked Fort Crescent. Part of what happened was the Spanish actually got a lucky shot and blew up a Spanish arsenal, which took out most of the fort and also took out most of the British powder and weapons supply. So the British were sitting there with almost no powder, no weapons. Because the numbers they had, they should have been able to stand up, but they didn't. So, May 10th, the fort surrenders, 1,100 British and Allies surrendered, and they took about 200 casualties. Most of the casualties, from what I can see, were caused by the explosion of the arsenal. Spain had 74 killed, 198 wounded, and I wonder how many of those were due to disease rather than enemy action. West Florida was under Spanish control. The next target would have been St. Augustine, but you can't do it in 1 year. Another battle, and this is really going to be one that's off, the Battle of Rotana in British Honduras. The Spanish actually took the small islands. There were some Spanish prisoners there and they wanted to free them. It's more off, it's British Honduras, but it's probably closer to Venezuela. They attacked that on March 16, 1782, stayed for about 2 days, got the Spaniards off and left. Siege of Gibraltar. This is one of the major things the Spanish wanted. They wanted Gibraltar back. Absolutely wanted Gibraltar back. Longest siege of the American Revolution was not in North America, it was in Europe. June 1779, February 1783, the Spanish and the French with, I think, some of the Flanders regiments laid siege to Gibraltar. The British had their garrison there, and they also had Hanoverian troops there. It was a combined French-Spanish force, British-Hanoverian force, and if you ever want to read a really interesting account of the siege, read the Siege of Gibraltar. There were all kinds of weird contraptions. The British had a cannon contraption to fire straight down, and they were not going to take Gibraltar. It's a giant rock. With artillery at that time, you're going to chip and make grapple. You weren't going to take the fort. Now, most people don't realize that Michigan was involved in the American Revolution. Battle of Fort St. Joseph, which is in Niles, Michigan. And Niles, Michigan, I think today is 190 people. It's a very small country. The fort was used to equip Miami and Potawatomi. The Spanish didn't like it because that was a threat to St. Louis and some of their other trading posts up the Mississippi. So they wanted to eliminate it. The Americans had tried to raid it, no success, and those were part of the troops that Clark had carried into Indiana and Illinois with him. Spanish expedition got the Milwaukee chief, and I'm not even going to try to massacre those names, and traveled to St. Louis. They arrived in 1780, reported their raid. Don Francisco dispatched militia under Captain Eugene Bouvet and 60 volunteers and native allies. So if he's only sending 60 guys, this is not a huge fort by any stretch of the imagination. They stayed at Dunsbridge, what is Dunsbridge, Indiana now, and promised Potawatomi, look, guys, stay out of this battle, and half the plunder's yours. You don't even have to work for it. We'll just give it to you. February 12, 1781, they raided the fort across the frozen river. They took the fort before the English could even respond. Apparently, the British that were there were mostly fur trappers and everything else, and they were sound asleep, and by the time the Spanish got on, he was over with. They stayed there for a day, looted the fort, gave the Potawatomi their share, and went back to St. Louis, taking the British colors with them. France and Spain took Minorca in 1782, and that was part of what Spain wanted. They did not get Gibraltar, they did get Minorca, and if you want to read an interesting history of an interesting island, read the history of Minorca. That thing has changed hands more times. It was Ottoman, it was French, it was English, it's truly amazing. Siege of Yorktown. The city of Havana donated 500,000 silver pesos to the siege of Yorktown. And what's amazing is they gathered those donations. This was not the Spanish government. Gathered donations in 24 hours. This is before Cash App. This is before all the modern ways of transferring money. They got 500,000 silver pesos to ship to the Americans in 24 hours. And the really amazing thing is they got it to the Americans through Spanish, or through a British blockade, and got it to Yorktown. That helped fund and pay not only the American troops, but also help pay the French troops. February 1780, the British attacked Nicaragua. because they wanted Nicaragua. The British wanted to cause Spain as much pain as they possibly could. Biggest problem they ran into is, again, disease, low supplies, and this really kind of insignificant guy was involved in it, a guy named Horatio Nelson. Anybody may have heard of him in the Battle of Trafalgar? Yeah, he was a mere captain at the time, and that was his first time he was ever involved in hand-to-hand combat. He ended up having to be evacuated because he got one of the local tropical diseases, which we don't know what it is, but he ended up being evacuated. So there's a tie to the Napoleonic Wars, Horatio Nelson, his first hand-to-hand combat, and if you ever seen him by the Napoleonic Wars, he, missing a hand, missing an eye. Spain captured. Galvez captures the Bahamas in 1782 and plans on taking Jamaica, 1783. Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution, stops the taking of Jamaica, and the British do get the Bahamas back, obviously. Now, Treaty of Paris is interesting. The dark blue is Spanish American. What the Spanish wanted is all this light blue. Now, they got Florida back. They got that back, but they wanted all of this. Guess where Tennessee lays? And what the Spanish wanted. Now, the British kind of trumped that by giving that to the Americans. Two reasons. A, trade would have been next to impossible. Because how are you going to get the goods you wanted out of everything west of the mountains to British ports? You didn't have access to New Orleans. You're going to ship it to the Great Lakes and up to St. Lawrence and across. So they let the Americans handle that problem. The Americans want to trade with us. If they want to bring their goods from Tennessee, Kentucky, and northern Georgia and everything else, they can deal with it. So the British preempted the Spanish and the French and gave that territory to the Americans. It also put the Americans in a position where they could trade with the British, and it was more profitable for them to trade with the British rather than the Spanish and the French. Now, American trader, anybody ever heard of General James Wilkinson? And I ran across this by pure accident when I was doing this. He served the American Revolution. He was a senior officer of the American Army under two presidents. That's basically would be the Army member that's on the Joint Chiefs of Staff now. That's basically the position he would command the Army. He was governor of the Louisiana Territory after the Louisiana Purchase. He was also the U.S. envoy to Mexico. And one of the things he tried, because Chad was, one of the park rangers here was telling me that John Sevier had tried to reach out to the Spanish during, the troubles here in Tennessee for them to become part of Spain. Well, this guy wanted Kentucky to become part of Spain. So, later on they found out he'd been a Spanish agent the whole time. He was referred to in Spanish documents as Agent 13. So he had been spying for the Spanish the whole time. And he was a senior man in the American Army. So there's not a whole lot the Spanish didn't know about the American Army, or America in general, because they were getting that. So post-war, Galvez died in 1784 in Mexico City of typhus. He was a fairly young man, what was he, early 40s maybe? Oliver Pollock dies in Pinckneyville, Mississippi in December 17, 1823. He survives a good long time, does become a businessman, still fairly wealthy. Arthur Lee dies in 1792. He was a member of the Lee family, or Robert E. Lee. He was also an abolitionist. He was a minister to Spain and Prussia. And he was minister to Spain and Prussia during the American Revolution. One of the other countries that was involved in the American Revolution on the American side was Prussia. Nobody thinks about that. They shipped supplies with Frederick of Prussia, hated the British. So he did ship muskets and supplies. I'm sure it wasn't the brand new muskets off the assembly line, but he did ship the American supplies. He also helped write the treaty with France They got the French in the war, also rooted Edward Bancroft, a British spy in the American legation in Paris. So the British actually had a spy on Franklin's staff, and he got it. So, time to vote. Spain, ally or opportunist? Just hold your hand, I'll go ally. Yeah, he would vote that. Opportunist? Yeah, I think you just lost that. You just lost that vote.
You left out a vital post